Hello, welcome to History Tea, a channel where I spill the tea on history. Today's video will be about the Occupation of Alcatraz, a 19-month-long reclamation of land led by indigenous peoples. Before I start, I just want to add a disclaimer real quick. The internet has put me through the ringer on this video. I have researched things that go as far back as ancient Egypt, and I've never experienced so many conflicting facts from different reputable sources. Like one thing saying the occupation ended on the 10th, and another saying the 11th, and one thing saying Yvonne Oakes was 13, and another saying she was 12. So if I do get anything wrong, I'm so sorry. It was not my intention. I tried to be as accurate as possible, and if you do notice a mistake, please feel free to point it out in the comments, and I will add a correction in the description box. So, on with the video. If you don't know, Alcatraz Island is located in the San Francisco Bay and was once home to Alcatraz Prison, which housed America's most dangerous criminals like Al Capone and Machine Gun Kelly, not the rapper. The prison closed in March of 1963 because it was just too expensive to run. So there were actually 3 occupations technically. The first occupation took place on March 8th, 1964, with a small party of about 40 CU people led by Richard Mackenzie, Mark Martinez, Walter Means, Garfield Spotted Elk, Alan Cottier, and Virgil Standing Elk. It only lasted for 4 hours, ending with the threat of a felony charge. Then, on October 10th, 1969, the San Francisco Indian Center burned down. This, and talk about using Alcatraz Island for commercial use, sparked a call to action for the second occupation of Alcatraz. The Indian Center provided indigenous peoples with jobs, healthcare, and legal aid. Up until this point, the Indian community were trying to take a more formal approach to obtaining the island with legal applications, but because of the loss of such an integral part of their community, they decided to take a different approach and planned a symbolic occupation for November 9th, 1969. The occupation was carried out by many student activists and led by Richard Oakes, Dr. Lenata Warjack Means, and Adam Fortunate Eagle. They had arranged for 5 boats to take them to the island, but none of them showed on the day, so Adam Fortunate Eagle convinced a man named Ronald Craig to let them on his yacht and pass by the island. He agreed, and when they were close enough, Richard Oakes, Joe Bill, Jim Vaughn, Ross Hardin, and Jerry Hatch jumped overboard and swam to the island. They occupied the island under right of discovery before being removed by the Coast Guard. And right of discovery basically means the right of a state to occupy an unclaimed land or territory. On the same day, after the removal of the first group, a second group made their way to the island. 14 of them stayed overnight and then left after Richard Oakes delivered a statement that was written by Adam Fortunate Eagle to the General Services and Mission, or the GSA, claiming the island by right of discovery. I actually found video of this, and I'll link it in the description because it was really cool. Oakes said that they were willing to purchase the land for $24 worth of glass beads and red cloth, which was the same price that the Dutch paid for the island of Manhattan. I love it. On November 20th, 1969, the third and final occupation began. There were students, married couples, 6 children, and over 30 women making their way to the island, coming to a total of 89 people. Of course, the Coast Guard got involved and set up a blockade that prevented most of the people from arriving to the island. 14 of the protesters proved successful, though. The island had 1 guard living on it, which, side note, it better be a well-paying job if you have to live alone on the island that is home to a supposedly haunted former prison. When the protesters landed on the island, the guards sent out a radio message saying, "Mayday, Mayday, the Indians have landed." Little overdramatic, dude, because if we're being honest, you were probably the only person on that island with a gun, therefore, you were the bigger threat. In the following days, many others joined the occupation. Soon they formed a governing council and developed their own clinic, kitchen, public relations department, a nursery, and a grade school for the children on the island. They also had a security team that watched for intruders on the shoreline called the Bureau of Caucasian Affairs, a play on the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which they hated. And a man named John Trudell started a radio broadcast called Radio Free Alcatraz. The occupiers moved into the old warden's house on the island and the guards' quarters. Although oftentimes the children on the island would have sleepovers in the abandoned cells of the prison. How fun. Now, real quick, I want to address the purpose of the protest. Lenata Means made it clear in her written statements that the purpose of the occupation was to have complete Indian control over the island under the Treaty of Fort Laramie. They wanted to develop a cultural center and museum that would provide jobs for indigenous peoples and a place for their children to learn about their culture and heritage. Basically a replacement for the center that they lost, but better. Over time, it became harder and harder for people to bring supplies and food to the occupants because of blockades set up by the Coast Guard. But still, people managed to sneak by in canoes. The occupation was garnering national and international attention. Many celebrities visited the island to show their support, including Jane Fonda and Marlon Brando. And Creedence Clearwater Revival, one of my favorite bands, donated $15,000 to the cause. That money was used to buy a boat to transport people back and forth from the island and was called the Clearwater. Another celebrity involved was Benjamin Bratt, who you may know as Eric Matthews from Miss Congeniality, or the man who broke Gracie Hart's heart. Bratt actually occupied the island with his mom and his siblings. On January 3rd, 1970, about a month and a half into the occupation, Yvonne Oakes, the stepdaughter of Richard Oakes, fell 3 stories to her death at only 13 years old, making it difficult for Richard and his wife Annie to stay on the island, and they ended up leaving. This drove different groups of activists to fight for control. Lenata Means and John Tudell ended up feuding over this. Lenata traveled to find more people to bring to the island, and while doing so, a rumor began that she had received an offer for a screen test from a movie producer. The protesters saw this as her becoming an opportunist, and they, along with John Tudell and their attorneys, turned on her. Just a few weeks after the death of Yvonne Oakes, a man named Robert Robertson visited the island. Robert Robertson. That's unfortunate. He was the executive director for the National Council on Indian Opportunity. Lenata Means Robertson and a group of occupiers had a meeting to discuss negotiations and safety. Robertson proposed an offer to build a park on the island for Indian use, but was rejected. The protesters wanted the whole island, not just a piece of their land back. Before Robertson left the island, Lenata asked him to join her and 3 lawyers for dinner to propose a grant to renovate the island, but he declined. Then, in June of 1970, President Nixon ended the U.S. tribal termination policy. In May of 1971, the government decided that they would never come to an agreement and decided to cut the electricity to the island. Just a few weeks later, a fire broke out, destroying several historic buildings on the island. The occupants didn't know how it started, claiming it was either an accident or the work of someone against them. Personally, my money's on the government. Somebody call Shane Dawson. We got a conspiracy over here. The occupation lasted for 19 months, ending on June 11, 1971, when the government removed the last 15 people from the island, claiming they needed to restore the island's lighthouse and foghorn. The 15 people that had stayed on the island were comprised of 6 men, 5 women, and 4 children. Adam Fortunate Eagle was quoted in April 1971 saying, "I don't want to say Alcatraz is done with, but no organized Indian groups are active there. It has turned from an Indian movement to a personality thing." The occupation drew a lot of attention to the mistreatment of indigenous peoples and how the U.S. government continuously ignored treaties. The protesters didn't end up getting the island, and it was turned into a national park in 1973. You can still see some of the graffiti today. Some of it has been purposely preserved or restored by the National Park Service. The occupation was a sort of Kickstarter for the activism of indigenous peoples. It led to many other occupations and protests like the ones at Plymouth Rock, Mount Rushmore, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and maybe even the recent Standing Rock. After the members of American Indian Movement, or AIM, seized the Mayflower II in 1970, they credited the occupation of Alcatraz as the symbol of a newly awakened desire among Indians for unity and authority in a white world. The government also started listening more and passed more than 50 legislative proposals supporting tribal self-rule and returned millions of acres of ancestral Indian land. Every November since 1975, Alcatraz Island has been the home of Unthanksgiving Day, celebrating Indian culture and activism. There's also a sunrise ceremony that takes place on the island to celebrate Indigenous Peoples Day, which some people still call Columbus Day. This is a very important piece of history. It's a story that should be told not only because of its significance at the time, but because of the weight it still carries today. Because Indigenous peoples are still fighting for basic human rights, and for their stories to be told and told correctly, and for the preservation of their culture and land. I really wanted to help out in some way, so I thought about donation. But then I remembered that I have literally $0. So, I figured I would link a donation page in the description below, so that maybe someone watching this will want to donate, and then I can kind of like help through them, like a secondhand donation. So I linked the donation page for the United Indians of All Tribes Foundation, which used to be Indians of All Tribes, which was one of the activist organizations involved in the occupation of Alcatraz. And that's the tea on history. Thank you for watching. Please make sure to like and subscribe if you want to see more. And I'm going to have a lot of things linked in the description box below, so make sure to check those out.